Some of the most overlooked characters in the Old Testament aren't people, they are places. The Promised Land is one of these, which plays a bigger role than simply providing a backdrop to the drama. There is an interesting cycle that occurs in the story of the Promised Land, one where sin and corruption and idolatry take hold, and where God rescues the land and restores it. In this lecture, we'll look at the connections between Israel's conquest of the Canaanites and her exile into Babylon centuries later. The Promised Land is, of course, the land of Canaan. It is first mentioned just as Abraham's story begins. His father, Terah, was on his way to Canaan when he presumably got sidetracked, so God called Abraham, or Abram as he was called at the time, to leave the rest of them behind and continue on the journey. God promises this land to Abram's descendants, and despite a few obstacles, he seems to have a little problem in settling in the land himself. But God tells Abram that his children won't get to live there right away. God's waiting for something. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, God tells him that his descendants won't be able to return until the fourth generation because of the iniquity, or sin, of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, the Amorites are in the land now, and God doesn't plan on kicking them out until they deserve it. God knows where their culture is heading, and he has planned to judge them at the right time. But when the time comes to drive them out, God indicates that he has additional concerns. In Exodus 23, verse 32, he warns them not to make a covenant with them or let any of them remain in the land, because if they do, they will lead Israel astray. And it isn't long before we see that these concerns are well-founded. Israel has a hard time being faithful to God, and doesn't finish purging the land as God says. In Judges 2, God has decided to punish Israel for her idolatry by using the original inhabitants against her, to test her. So this cleansing of the land was incomplete, and there would be consequences for God's chosen people. So God keeps his promise to Abraham, and his descendants inherit the land. After kingship is established and David comes to power, God promises that David's descendants will rule on his throne forever. This is a huge promise for God to make, given Israel's shaky history. For the next few centuries, Israel will have its share of victories and defeats, times of faithfulness and times of idolatry. But one of the darkest days in Judah would come during the reign of King Manasseh, one of David's descendants, and one of the most evil kings in either Israel or Judah. God actually declared him to be worse than the Amorites he had driven out to begin with. How is it possible that the children of God, the children of God's promise, could be worse than the people who, as far as we know, had no contact with God? This is the point in which God declares the next chapter of the Promised Land's history. He says, "I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish." The time is coming when the land will have to be cleansed again, this time from God's own covenant people. So the Promised Land was full of idolatry and unbelief under the Amorites, and God used the Israelites to judge those people and restore justice and true worship in the land. But now the Promised Land is full of idolatry and unbelief under the Israelites. So God raises up Babylon to judge Israel, specifically the southern kingdom of Judah. And one of the ways the land will be restored is it will finally experience the Sabbath rest that Israel failed to keep all those centuries. This is good news for the Promised Land. But what about God's promises to Abraham and David? Here's the twist. God is not rejecting Israel in favor of Babylon. There's no expectation that justice and right worship will be restored under the rule of foreign powers. Instead, God will use this exile to bring Israel back to him, and to bear witness to the God of Israel as one true God among the nations. Rather than right worship being found again in the Promised Land, right worship will be found in individual men and women all over the empire. Just as allowing the Amorites to live infected Israel with false worship, allowing the Israelites to live infected Babylon with true worship. As happens so many times in Scripture, what man planned for evil, God allowed for good. By the time the Old Testament closes, God has restored his people back in the land. The temple is rebuilt, and justice and right worship reign in the land once more. Mostly. But they're not yet free. Their Babylonian rulers became the Persian rulers, which would later become their Greek rulers and their Roman rulers. Their restoration is incomplete until their Messiah comes and takes his place on the throne of David. Scholars debate whether this means Israel as a nation has a unique future in God's plan, or if the Messiah's rule will simply be fulfilled when Jesus takes the throne as king over the whole world. Either way, we can see how the Canaanite conquest and Babylonian exile play unique but deeply connected roles in the history of God's people, and the crucial role that the Promised Land plays in God's story.